Behind the silk curtains.
History often paints queens and princesses as figures of divine elegance, gliding through glittering halls in silk gowns, with jewels sparkling under candlelight. Yet behind those velvet curtains and golden thrones existed a reality far removed from the fairy tales we imagine. Life in a medieval or early modern palace was not only uncomfortable, but often shockingly filthy, even for the highest women of the court. In the early centuries, palaces lacked what we now consider basic necessities: running water, proper sewage systems, and even fresh air circulation. The grand halls of Europe's most powerful dynasties were filled with ornate furniture, but also with dust, fleas, and the lingering odor of unwashed bodies. Royal women, despite their silken gowns and jeweled crowns, lived in conditions that would today be considered unbearable. Many queens and princesses were rarely allowed to bathe. In fact, some were warned that immersing the body in water could open the pores and invite disease. So, instead of soap and water, they were left with a layer of sweat beneath their heavy gowns, which they wore for days, sometimes weeks, without washing. Beneath the folds of velvet, silk, and lace, grime accumulated. Imagine a queen walking into a grand ceremony, her perfume masking not just her own odor, but that of the entire palace around her. The royal bedchambers, often decorated with priceless tapestries and paintings, were equally misleading. Beneath the rich fabrics and fine embroidery, vermin thrived. Rats scurried through the corridors, fleas nested in the bedding, and lice were an unshakable part of daily life. Queens were not spared from these irritations. In fact, their elaborate wigs and headdresses often became hiding places for such pests. One telling example comes from the French court, where Queen Marie Antoinette's beauty and charm captivated the world. But behind closed doors, her reality was less glamorous. The Palace of Versailles, despite its grand appearance, was notorious for its stench. Human waste often piled up in corners of the corridors, and the overwhelming mixture of perfumes, sweat, and decay created an atmosphere that no amount of roses in the garden could mask. It wasn't only France. Across Europe, similar stories unfolded. In England, noblewomen endured gowns so tightly fitted that changing them daily was nearly impossible. The undergarments, rarely washed, held the sweat of days past, and the bodices sometimes pressed so hard against the body that sores and rashes formed beneath. These queens and princesses were trapped in a cycle of elegance and misery, forced to look pristine while enduring an environment of filth. Even their eating habits revealed a shocking contrast. Banquets dazzled with gold cups and silver platters, but the dining halls reeked of spilled wine, rotting meat, and unwashed hands. Women of the court might have smiled gracefully as musicians played, but the air they breathed was heavy with foul odors lingering just beyond the flickering candles. The contradiction is striking. These women were symbols of refinement and virtue to their people, yet they lived in a world where washing was dangerous, waste was unavoidable, and parasites were daily companions. The polished image of queens and princesses that survives in paintings and stories is, in truth, a mask hiding the gritty reality of royal life. Their struggles remind us that history's most glamorous figures were also its most human, trapped in circumstances that glittered on the outside but decayed within. And this is only the beginning. For the deeper we look into the private lives of these royal women, the more shocking truths we uncover about their hidden habits and untold struggles. 2. Perfumes instead of baths. In today's world, personal hygiene is considered a daily necessity, but in centuries past, queens and princesses lived under very different standards. To many royal women, water was not a friend, it was a danger. Bathing was often discouraged by doctors, who believed that warm water could weaken the body, open the pores, and invite illness. Instead of soap and water, royal women turned to perfumes, powders, and scented oils to cover what lingered beneath their gowns. Perfume was not simply a luxury in the royal courts, it was survival. Thick clouds of rosewater, lavender, and musk became the invisible shield against foul odors, Princesses would carry small pomanders, spherical containers filled with spices and herbs, clutched tightly in their hands or tied to their belts, so that with every breath they inhaled fragrance rather than the stench of sweat and decay. Some queens even had entire rooms filled with herbs and dried flowers, believing the scent itself could protect them from disease. One of the most famous examples comes from Queen Elizabeth I of England. Renowned for her regal presence, she was said to bathe only a few times a year. Instead, she relied on perfumes and scented linen to keep her aura fresh. Her glowing image in portraits was carefully maintained with powders and perfumes, but behind that majesty, the truth was far less pristine. French princesses, too, were masters of disguise when it came to hygiene. At Versailles, courtiers would douse themselves with layer after layer of cologne. The palace itself was infamous for its lack of proper sanitation. Waste was disposed of carelessly, and even the most magnificent rooms carried a permanent stench. Perfume became less of a luxury and more of a necessity, a daily mask against an unavoidable odor. The fascination with perfumes also revealed the enormous wealth of queens and princesses. Their collections included rare ingredients imported from distant lands, ambergris from Wales, civet from exotic cats, and expensive resins from the East. These ingredients produced strong, lasting fragrances, but they also hinted at something else: the desperation to escape the reality of unwashed bodies and foul air. But perfumes could only do so much. Beneath the silken layers, sweat clung to the skin. The tightly laced corsets and gowns meant that air barely reached their bodies, leaving the skin irritated and covered with rashes. Powdered wigs, though majestic in appearance, often absorbed sweat and odors, turning into breeding grounds for lice. Even with the strongest perfumes, the natural smell of the human body eventually overpowered the sweet notes of lavender and rose. Perhaps the most striking contradiction was the way queens and princesses were adored by their people for their supposed purity and refinement. Songs praised their beauty, poets compared them to goddesses, and portraits immortalized them with radiant perfection. Yet those closest to them, the maids, attendants, and physicians, knew the reality was much less enchanting. Perfumes served another purpose as well. They were believed to protect against disease. In an era when plagues swept through Europe, the air itself was thought to be poisonous. Royals carried scented handkerchiefs or even stuffed herbs into their clothing, hoping the fragrance would shield them from illness. Queens who seldom bathed felt reassured that the aroma of mint or rosemary might act as invisible armor against deadly contagions. This reliance on perfumes over bathing shaped not only the habits of queens and princesses, but also the entire culture of their courts. Courtiers competed to create the most unique and powerful scents, each striving to prove their refinement through the air they carried with them. In truth, this obsession was a cover, a perfumed veil stretched over a foundation of filth. When we imagine queens walking gracefully through their palaces, we often think of elegance and refinement. But the reality was far less romantic. A cloud of perfume hiding the stench of sweat, unwashed skin, and suffocating gowns. Perfumes were the crown's invisible jewels, glittering in scent, but masking a world that was anything but clean. 3. Deadly cosmetics and rotten teeth. If perfumes were used to mask the smell of unwashed bodies, cosmetics were employed to conceal the marks of poor hygiene and disease. Queens and princesses were the ultimate symbols of beauty and refinement. But the lengths they went to in order to preserve their appearances often had deadly consequences. Behind the powdered faces and painted lips lay a reality that was both dangerous and grotesque. One of the most notorious examples of toxic beauty came from the use of lead-based white powders. In an age when pale, porcelain skin was the highest standard of beauty, royal women covered their faces with thick layers of Venetian ceruse, a cosmetic made from white lead and vinegar. This substance gave them the ghostly pallor admired by poets and artists, but it also poisoned their skin, rotting it from within. Prolonged use caused hair loss, severe scarring, and even death. Yet many queens continued to apply it daily, valuing their image above their health. Queen Elizabeth I of England was one of the most famous users of white lead. Known as the Virgin Queen, her appearance was central to her public image. But over time, her heavy use of ceruse destroyed her skin, forcing her to apply even more layers to cover the damage. By the end of her life, she was said to have worn masks of makeup so thick that her natural face was almost unrecognizable. Her beauty, once admired across Europe, had become a prison of her own making. The danger did not stop at the face. Rouge for the cheeks and lips often contained mercury, another deadly toxin. Women applied it daily to give themselves the illusion of health and vitality, not realizing they were slowly poisoning their bodies. Some princesses developed trembling hands, madness, or infertility, all linked to the heavy use of mercury-based cosmetics. Yet the court praised their beauty, oblivious to the silent destruction beneath the powder. Teeth were another battlefield where appearance clashed with reality. Dental hygiene was almost non-existent, and queens and princesses were no exception. Sugar, imported from the New World, became a fashionable luxury among royals, but it quickly eroded their teeth. Cavities, blackened gums, and rotting mouths were common, even among the wealthiest women of Europe. Catherine de' Medici of France was known for her love of sweets, but it came at a price. Her decaying teeth were so notorious that she often refused to smile in public. Elizabeth I also suffered from severe tooth decay. By her later years, her breath was said to be unbearable, and she had lost many of her teeth. Servants whispered about her inability to eat properly, even while she appeared regal at banquets. To mask these flaws, some queens wore false teeth made from ivory or even the teeth of deceased subjects, crudely fitted into the mouth with wire. These dentures were uncomfortable and often worsened the problem, causing infection and swelling. Yet to maintain the illusion of beauty, royal women endured the pain, smiling with false teeth as if nothing were wrong. Wigs and powders added another layer of deception. When smallpox scars, baldness, or rotting teeth marred their appearances, queens turned to elaborate wigs dusted with scented powders. The wigs were magnificent, towering structures decorated with ribbons, jewels, and even miniature ships. But beneath the glamour, lice thrived, and the powders often irritated the scalp, leaving sores and infections. The irony of these habits is striking. Queens and princesses, adored for their beauty, were in reality destroying their bodies to preserve it. The very cosmetics that gave them glowing skin, rosy lips, and graceful smiles were slowly killing them. Behind every royal portrait of perfect elegance was a woman suffering the hidden consequences of her regal routine. This obsession with image reveals a deeper truth. Queens and princesses were trapped by expectations. Their beauty was not their own. It belonged to the court, to the poets who praised them, to the kings who displayed them, and to the people who worshipped them. In their desperate attempts to meet these expectations, they turned to poisons disguised as powders, and in doing so, they sacrificed their health for an illusion that could never last. In the flickering light of candlelit halls, their painted faces may have seemed radiant, but in reality, beneath the toxic layers of makeup and the false smiles of rotting teeth, these royal women lived not as goddesses but as fragile mortals, chained to the cruel standards of their time, dining like nobility, living in filth. If beauty routines revealed the dangerous extremes queens and princesses endured, their dining habits exposed yet another contradiction of royal life. Banquets in medieval and early modern courts were legendary. Golden goblets overflowing with wine, long tables stacked with roasted meats, sugared fruits, and exotic spices brought from distant lands. To the common people, these feasts were a dazzling symbol of wealth and power. But to those seated at the tables, the reality was far less refined, often shockingly unhygienic, even grotesque. Royal kitchens were busy, chaotic, and filthy. Without refrigeration, meat spoiled quickly, especially in the sweltering summers. Servants often prepared dishes from food that had already begun to rot, masking the foul taste with heavy spices such as cloves, cinnamon, and nutmeg. Queens and princesses, sitting under glittering chandeliers, unknowingly consumed meals crawling with bacteria. Food poisoning was common, though often mistaken for curses or divine punishment. Banquet halls themselves were no better. In England, France, and Spain alike, nobles and royals feasted in large halls where dogs roamed freely, gnawing on scraps under the tables. Bones, half-eaten meat, and grease-stained bread were tossed carelessly onto the floor. The stench of wine, sweat, and rotting food mixed with the smoke of hundreds of candles, choking the air. Queens and princesses, expected to smile gracefully, endured the same foul atmosphere as everyone else. Table manners, too, were far from what we might imagine. Forks, though common today, were considered unnecessary or even sinful in earlier centuries. Royals often ate with their bare hands, tearing meat apart, licking their fingers, and wiping them on the tablecloths or the sleeves of their gowns. Princesses, who were praised in poetry as paragons of refinement, sat at tables smeared with grease and wine, their jeweled rings caked with food. Hygiene during these meals was appalling. Communal cups were passed from hand to hand, carrying disease. Dishes were shared, with multiple people dipping greasy fingers into the same bowl. Napkins were rare, and when they were used, they were often never washed. The contrast between the elegance of a golden plate and the filth of its use could not have been greater. Even more shocking was the handling of waste. In palaces such as Versailles, banquets could last for hours, with guests consuming vast quantities of food and wine. Yet toilets were scarce. Courtiers sometimes relieved themselves in hidden corners of the palace or even in the stairwells. The stench clung to the air, mixing with the aromas of roasted meats and sweet pastries. Queens and princesses, despite their rank, were not immune to this atmosphere of filth. History records that Catherine de' Medici, famed Queen of France, once shocked her guests by introducing the fork to court dining. While her refinement impressed some, others mocked the idea of eating with prongs of metal instead of fingers. But as forks slowly gained acceptance, they remained rare luxuries, symbols of refinement reserved for only a few. For most queens and princesses, even at their grandest tables, eating was a messy affair. Food was also deeply tied to power and politics. Queens used banquets to impress foreign dignitaries, displaying mountains of exotic dishes. But behind the scenes, kitchens overflowed with filth. Rats scurried across storerooms, bread grew moldy, and servants often reused scraps from previous meals. In an age when plague spread easily, the dining halls of royalty were breeding grounds for disease. The irony of these banquets is hard to ignore. Queens and princesses, dressed in silks and jewels, sat before mountains of food that symbolized abundance, yet often risked illness with every bite. Their polished images in portraits, delicately holding goblets or nibbling on fruit, disguised the chaos of the world around them. The spilled wine, greasy fingers, barking dogs, and stinking floors. To the common people outside the palace walls, royalty seemed to live lives of perfection, but the truth was far different. In reality, dining like nobility meant enduring filth, chaos, and disease. The illusion of refinement, like the perfumes and cosmetics they wore, was just another mask, one that hid the decaying reality of palace life. 5. Secret chambers and waste disposal. If royal banquets revealed the excess and filth of dining, the question of what happened afterward is even more unsettling. Behind the grandeur of palaces, the most basic problem remained unsolved: waste disposal. For queens and princesses, this was an unavoidable reality that no amount of silk, jewels, or perfume could mask. Life inside castles and palaces was plagued by smells and sights that would shock modern sensibilities. Unlike today, medieval and early modern palaces had no proper sewage systems. Instead, waste was collected in chamber pots, often kept in the very rooms where royalty slept or entertained guests. These pots were emptied by servants, but not always quickly or thoroughly. At Versailles, for example, it was common for corridors and stairwells to reek of urine, as attendants sometimes dumped chamber pots out of windows or into palace corners. Queens and princesses, despite their rank, could not escape the foul odors that lingered in their chambers. Even the most private royal routines were far from glamorous. Thrones used by queens were sometimes designed with hidden openings, allowing them to relieve themselves discreetly during long ceremonies. These so-called close stools were padded with velvet and embroidered with gold, yet they led to buckets that required frequent emptying. A queen could spend hours adorned in silks and pearls, while beneath her feet a servant carried away her waste. The royal gardens, so admired for their beauty, also suffered from the lack of sanitation. Visitors to Versailles wrote of the overwhelming stench, as many courtiers and servants used the gardens as makeshift toilets. Queens strolling among the roses and fountains had to navigate not only crowds, but also the foul reminders of daily life. Behind the fragrance of blooming flowers, a much darker odor filled the air. Hygiene within private chambers was equally grim. Mattresses, stuffed with straw or feathers, were rarely cleaned, often soaked with sweat and sometimes even urine. Fleas and lice thrived in the bedding, biting queens and princesses as they slept. The silken curtains surrounding royal beds may have looked heavenly, but the reality inside was far from divine. A notorious example comes again from Versailles, where foreign dignitaries reported their shock at the palace's lack of sanitation. Despite being the center of culture and sophistication, the palace stank so badly that some visitors fainted. The very same halls where queens appeared in dazzling gowns for grand balls were also places where chamber pots were stored, waste lingered, and stenches clung to the air. Even when waste was removed, it was often dumped into nearby rivers or moats, contaminating water supplies. Queens and princesses might have drunk from gilded cups, but the water inside was sometimes polluted, carrying disease. Outbreaks of dysentery and other illnesses were common, even among the royal family. Behind the polished surface of power, filth seeped into every corner. The daily reality of queens and princesses was a constant balancing act between glamour and grime. They were expected to embody refinement, yet their lives were steeped in the same unsanitary practices as the common people, only magnified by the scale of palace life. To endure this, they relied on perfumes, powders, and rituals of cleanliness that only disguised the truth. The irony was painful. Queens who ruled empires, who commanded armies and influenced politics, could not control the smell in their own chambers. Princesses raised to embody grace and purity walked through corridors reeking of waste. The illusion of divine beauty was always one gust of foul air away from shattering. History remembers their elegance, their jeweled crowns, their painted portraits. But beneath it all lay the unavoidable truth. Even the most powerful women in the world were not spared from the filth of their age. Their lives were lived between golden thrones and overflowing chamber pots, between roses in the garden and waste at their roots. This contrast makes their stories all the more human, fragile, imperfect, and strikingly real. 6. The glamour versus the reality. From the outside, the lives of queens and princesses shimmered with brilliance. Their portraits, painted by the finest artists of the age, displayed flawless faces, immaculate gowns, and crowns glittering with jewels. To their subjects, these women seemed closer to angels than mortals, symbols of refinement, beauty, and divine authority. Yet history tells us a very different story, one where glamour was nothing more than a thin veil stretched over decay, discomfort, and filth. Behind the painted smiles and perfumed halls, Queens and princesses lived with lice in their wigs, fleas in their beds, and odors that perfume could never fully disguise. Their dazzling gowns concealed unwashed bodies, their powdered faces hid scars and sores, and their banquet halls were rife with rotting food and foul stenches. Even in the most magnificent palaces, rats and vermin thrived, a constant reminder that no amount of gold could erase the harsh realities of their age. The contradiction was perhaps the most striking element of their lives. These women represented ideals of purity and refinement, yet their daily routines were steeped in practices that would horrify modern standards. Bathing was rare, chamber pots overflowed, and dangerous cosmetics slowly poisoned their bodies. They were trapped between expectation and reality, forced to appear divine while living in conditions that were often worse than those of their subjects. Consider the endless portraits of noble women. Smooth skin, radiant cheeks, graceful smiles. These images were carefully constructed illusions, crafted to maintain the myth of royal perfection. But in truth, many queens bore pockmarked faces from smallpox, blackened teeth from sugar, and thinning hair from toxic powders. Pain and discomfort became part of their identity, hidden behind layers of paint and pearls. The irony is that their glamour was not a luxury of choice, it was a duty. Queens and princesses were political symbols, embodiments of dynastic power. Their beauty was not only personal, but national, a reflection of the strength and prestige of the crown itself. To falter, to reveal the truth of filth and frailty, would have been to weaken that image. And so they endured. They laced their corsets tighter, powdered their faces whiter, and doused themselves in perfumes stronger than the odors around them. Yet in this endurance lies their humanity. These women, elevated above all others, shared the same struggles as ordinary people: illness, discomfort, and the daily battle against an unsanitary world. Their stories remind us that even behind crowns of gold and gowns of silk, queens and princesses were not immune to the grime of history. They were fragile, imperfect, and astonishingly human. When we look back today, we can admire their resilience. To live in such conditions, to carry the burden of image and power, and to do so with grace in the eyes of their people, required immense strength. Their elegance was not born of cleanliness or comfort, but of determination to uphold an illusion that defined their world. So the next time we picture a queen stepping through her palace in shimmering gowns and jeweled crowns, let us remember the truth. Behind the silks and perfumes, behind the banquets and portraits, was a woman struggling with the same realities as anyone else, only magnified by the weight of expectation. The untold, filthy habits of queens and princesses reveal not shame, but humanity. And it is in this contrast between glamour and reality that their stories remain both shocking and unforgettable.